So the beginning of chapter 1 is sort of the Alter Rebbe setting up his premise. The end of chapter 1, the Alter Rebbe informs us that every single Jewish person has two souls. Soul number 1 is the natural, the animal, the selfish soul. And that we're going to discuss at length in a few chapters. But the second soul, the one that we're focusing on right now, is the godly soul. And this soul, as we discussed in chapter 2, is a literal piece of God. And what we mean by that is that God himself, the way he is for himself, blew, which as we explained, blowing connotates sending out from your essence. Not talking, you could talk all day because it's not coming out from your essence. But blowing from within, that's what God did. He blew that soul into us. But as we discussed in chapter 2, that blow, that didn't happen directly. And while the soul was traveling from where it was blown out, from God himself, down to this world, it passed through many, many levels and sort of picked up different attributes and different standards. And that's where we get that even though every single soul, every single of the second soul, the godly soul, is at its core the same, it comes from God's essence, but different people, different generations, and different levels, even within our soul, are different because of the different disturbances and different imperfections that it picks up coming through the different spiritual worlds. That was chapter 2. In chapter 3, the Alter Rebbe told us about the idea of what is the makeup of our soul. And as we explained, the soul is made up of 10 attributes. And these 10 attributes are 3 intellectual ones, the way we relate to God in thought, and the emotional attributes, the way we love God, the way we fear God, the way we want to become closer to God, etc. And that is the makeup, and that is the second soul, the godly soul.
We talked about 10 attributes, 3 intellectual.
And 7 emotional.
And 7 emotional.
And 7 emotional. Okay. And those are Chachma, Bina, Dat, Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, Hod, Yesod, Malchus, which you discussed a little bit at length. This is a longer topic that we'll cover a little bit more in depth later on. But generally speaking, these are 10 different emotions or 10 different feelings, both intellectual and emotional, that we have towards God. Now we're going to go a level further. And we're going to discuss in chapter 4, how does the soul interact? How does the soul act? How does the soul accomplish anything? Because as we all know, we can feel inspired from today until tomorrow. But if we don't do something about it, if we don't act on it, nothing was accomplished. And the way that the soul, the spiritual being, accomplishes something, the way it interacts, is through what in Kabbalistical terms is called the clothing, the levushim. These levushim, which literally translate as clothing, and as we'll see, there's a good reason why we use the parable of clothing. Clothing are how we interact with the world around us. Clothing are what allow us to participate in society. And you can usually tell someone's job, and you could tell someone's personality based on how they dressed. Right? Most Chabad rabbis have a very similar personality, which is why we all dress the same. But it allows people to do with specific jobs. Their clothing allows them to accomplish those jobs. And that is the idea of clothing. Another good way of putting it these are 10 ways, these are ways, these levushim, these clothing, are ways in which the soul can express itself. Right? Let's talk about ourselves. If you feel an emotion, you feel love for someone else, that feeling could be the most strong, overwhelming feeling of love. But how do you express it? How do you express your love for someone else? Well, you have to do something about it. Either you do an action, you buy them a gift, you do them a favor, right? You have to do an action to express that feeling. Or you talk, right? You say, I love you. Those words are an expression of a feeling that you have inside. Even intellectually, if you plan a gift, right? You're going to buy them a gift. Even the very action of planning it and thinking about what would they like and what don't they like and what's their favorite style and all of those thoughts are also an expression of your love. Because you're using your intellect, you're using your thoughts to express and to facilitate your emotions. And so what we discussed about the soul has its 10 attributes, the 10 ways It can sort of experience godliness. It can be thinking about godliness. It could be having, I don't want to say the word thinking. That's more what we're talking about today. It can understand godliness. It can feel love for God. It can feel fear. It can feel awe. It can feel a lot of different feelings. But how does it express it? That is through the three garments. The three levushim, these three expressions that we're going to be talking about today. And it's important to remember that clothing are not us. Right? Clothing, you can swap them, you can be feeling one thing, you can be wearing one thing one day, and you could change it out. And this is very much true with the soul as well. In chapter 3, we spoke about the soul itself, its 10 attributes, the 10 things it can be experiencing about God. Now we're talking about 3 external things. Just like our clothing are external to us, so too, what the soul uses to facilitate its feelings towards God, or it's whatever it's experiencing towards God, those are outside of it. As we'll see what those garments are. There's a great story really bringing out the difference of who we are and who our clothing are. That back in Eastern Europe, where in the shtetl life, there was a certain rabbi, a certain Hasidic master, who heard that one community of his followers were not being very careful in the mitzvah of hachnasas archim, of inviting guests. Who used to work in the shtetl was that there were a lot of wandering paupers or wandering travelers, people, whether they were salesmen or just people wandering from place to place. And generally speaking, when you showed up, if you were a wanderer, if you showed up in a city, you would hope that you'd be invited for Shabbat dinner, you'd invited for a place to stay. Very often the synagogues had sort of a little hostel attached to them for travelers, but for Shabbat dinner, most people would be invited. And he heard that in this one town, they weren't being that, and many people were stuck staying in the hostel, that little room, for Shabbat as well. So he decided to test it out, and so he put on a disguise, and he traveled to that city, and sure enough, nobody invited him for dinner, no one invited him and he was upset about it. And so he went back to his own hometown, and he sent a message, as the rabbi that he was, he told that town, I'm coming for a visit. Of course, the great rabbi is coming, preparations, and everyone's planning a banquet, and everything is set up in the streets for his honor. It comes to the Friday night dinner, a huge banquet set up, and the whole community is there, and they start serving the food, and the rabbi takes a piece of gefilte fish and puts it on his hat. He takes a bit of the salad and stuffs it into his pocket. He takes some of the chicken and puts it on his lap. The community is looking at him. What in the world is going on? And finally, someone musters up the courage, and they ask him, what are you doing? So he says, clearly, all of this honor, all of this ceremony, all of this beauty is just for my clothing. Because I was here a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't get any of this. So if it's for my clothing, I'm going to give it to my clothing. It's not for me, it's for my clothing. That idea of that the clothing are not who we are, they're external to us, is going to be an important factor in our relationship with these clothing. What are these clothing? What are these ways that the soul can express itself? We're talking about the godly soul. How does the godly soul express its feelings towards God? Through the mitzvos. Through learning Torah and doing mitzvos. That is what the way that the inspiration or the fear or the awe, or whatever the soul is experiencing towards God, that's how it acts on it, that's how it expresses it. As we're going to read inside, starting on page 79, chapter 4. V'oid yesh l'chol nefesh elekis shloisha levushim shemachshava dibur remaisa shel tayag mitzvahs haTorah. In addition to her 10 faculties, which again we spoke about last time in chapter 3, every divine soul has 3 clothes: the powers of verbal thought, speech, and action by which she engages in the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. The mitzvahs that we do can be divided. Some mitzvahs we do by action, some mitzvahs we do by speech, and some mitzvahs we do by thought. As the Alter Rebbe is about to go into detail on page 80, this means that when you fulfill all the mitzvahs that require action, when you engage your speech in Torah study, which is a discussion of all 613 mitzvahs and their application, right? What mitzvahs do you perform by speech? Well, prayer is one example, but more than that, and you can do all day, is learning Torah. When we learn Torah, we're supposed to verbalize it. because then we're looping in another one. We're not just understanding it, we're also verbalizing it. Our speech is also involved in this process. And finally, ubmachshava shehu masik kol ma she'efshar lo lahasig b'pshat remez drus sod haTorah. And when you engage your verbal thought in whatever you are able to grasp in the four realms of Torah's orchard, its simplest level, illusion, hidden meaning, and secrets. Right? The Torah, as we've discussed many times, the Torah is like an onion. There's always a deeper level. You can peel a layer and go a level deeper. Torah's sweet, so that's one difference. But the Torah is always, and generally speaking, these are four levels of the simple meaning. There's the hints that are contained within the Torah, that's one level deeper. There's the hidden meanings, and there are the secrets, the Kabbalah that we have. And so when you use your brain to understand to understand the Torah in all of its different levels, what's really happening is your godly soul is using the garment of thought, of intellect, to express its relationship with God. As we're going to continue to explain on page 81, then, as a whole, the 613 limbs of your soul are invested within the 613 mitzvos of the Torah. It's a fascinating conversation. There are 613 mitzvos of the Torah, and the sages compare that there are apparently 613 parts of our body, depending exactly how you count. But there are also 613 parts of our soul. And so when our soul experiences and does one of the mitzvos, it's creating a bond between that part of its soul and God. It's fascinating because even on the physical side, don't ask me any details because I don't know, but Kabbalistically speaking, you can connect mitzvos, each one of the 613 mitzvos, with each one of the 613 parts of our body. And there have been stories, again, I'm not an expert, but there are Kabbalistical books about it, and there are stories that people were experiencing an issue with a certain part of their body, and they went to a Kabbalist, and the Kabbalist told them, strengthen that mitzvah. It seemed like a random mitzvah, but there's some correlation there is some connection, because the 613 mitzvos correspond to the 613 parts of our body, as well as to the 613 parts of our soul. And so when we think about the soul, and what the soul wants to accomplish, as we discussed in chapter 2, the godly soul has one mission, has one thing it wants to do. It wants to connect to God. It wants to return to God. It wants to be one with God. How do you do that? The only way the soul can, by doing mitzvahs. By doing the things that God gave us to connect to Him. And that is how the soul, whether it's understanding the intellect, right? There's a difference between what we understand and what we're thinking about. We all have knowledge that's somewhere in our head, but if we're not actively thinking about it, we're not expressing that knowledge, right? We're not experiencing that knowledge right now. We're all going to walk away from this class with certain facts that we know, right? The very simple fact that our souls have three bodies. But each one of us will be thinking about that at different times, because each one of us will be experiencing and using the garment of our intellect. Right? I'm differentiating here that we have our intellect, which is a garment. It's a tool that the soul uses to understand and to experience the thoughts that it has about God. Right? We spoke about how the soul has 10 levels. The top 3 are intellectual ones. The soul understands certain things about God. What do we do about that? We think about them. And we use the tool of intellect, we use the lavush, the garment of intellect, to experience those. As the Alter Rebbe continues on page 82, Ubepratis, more specifically, Bechinos chachma bina das shebenafsho milubeshes b'hasagas hatera shehu masig b'pshat remez druseit kefi yocheles hasagay v'sherish nafshe l'mayla. You learn Torah. You engage your mind in the pursuit of grasping as much of the 4 levels of its orchard as your intelligence and the origin of your soul above permit. Your soul's faculties of chachma, bina, and das are now invested in your act of consciously understanding the Torah. Continuing, v'hamidais shehemira v'ava v'anfeim v'toldeseim muluvashis b'kiyim hamitzvos b'maisa. You fulfill mitzvahs. They require that you engage in certain activities. Your soul's emotion, fear, love, and their branches and offshoots are now invested in those activities. There's a very famous thing which we will revisit throughout Tanya. There are only two reasons to do something you wouldn't have otherwise done. Right? If you wouldn't have otherwise done something, if someone asked you to do them a favor, you wouldn't have done otherwise. There's only two reasons why you would do it. One is out of love. Right? And obviously that runs a gamut of, there's a spectrum of what kind of love we're talking about. But that feeling of love says, even though I wasn't going to drive you to the airport, I appreciate you, I have a relationship with you, I'll do you a favor. And we're not saying that I have something against doing that favor, but I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have driven to the airport anyways. But because of you, because of our relationship, I'm going to do it. The other side of that coin is fear. Right? And fear, as we're going to see, has different gradations of fear. On a very literal level, I'm scared that you'll yell at me, and I'm scared that you'll do to me if I say no. Right? A dictator, the reason why people listen to a dictator is because they're afraid of him. Right? In Hasidic thought, the difference between a king and a dictator is a king you listen to out of love, and a dictator you listen to out of fear. Those two motivators are the emotional parts of the soul, right? Even though we said there's 7 emotional attributes, we can generally group them up into love and fear. There's the positive ones and the, I don't want to say negative, but the more stringent ones, right? There's the positive and negative, the love and the fear. And those are the motivators. So when I do a mitzvah, if God had not told me to put on tefillin this morning, would I have wrapped leather straps around my arm? No. It's just not something I would have done. Why am I doing it? Well, either because I have love or I have fear, right? And as we'll see in a moment what that fear means. But let's focus on the love for now. I love God. I want to listen to what God tells me to do, and therefore I'm wrapping leather straps around my arm. And finally, the final line on page 82, Ubedibur hu Talmud Torah shekeneged kulam. You learn Torah by speaking out loud, a mitzvah that is equal to all the other mitzvahs combined. Those same emotions of your soul are now invested in the act of speaking out the Torah's words. The emotion of God gave me a Torah. I want to learn it, I want to experience it, and as we'll see, the great connection that we build with God through learning His Torah. So right now, I'm saying words of Torah. Why? Because my godly soul has a love of God. My godly soul has a fear of God. And therefore, I want to act on those emotions. How do I act on them? Well, using my faculty of speech by learning Torah out loud. And again, there is definitely a huge, Torah can be, Torah we generally think of as an intellectual pursuit, where we try to understand as much as Torah. Torah is also verbal. We're supposed to learn Torah out loud. Specifically, because it involves another part of our body, it brings it down more physical as opposed to the temporal part of our brain. Let's go back for a second to discuss the love and fear that motivates us to do these things. Because again, the attributes that we discussed in chapter 3, those motivate us to use our faculties to actually actualize those feelings. So on page 84, why do we say that the soul's emotions are invested within those mitzvos? Ki ha'ava hi shorish kol ramach mitzvos aseh u'mimenahim neshachis u'ba'alde ein lahem kiyam amiti. Because love is the origin of all 248 positive mitzvahs. It is from love that they are drawn, and without love, your mitzvahs are missing their authentic fulfillment. And here's an important point, because sometimes we fall into the trap of I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling inspired today, and therefore I won't do the mitzvahs. That's incorrect. We're going to be talking today a lot about the importance of the emotion and of the feeling and of the inspiration. But we can't lose the action as well, because as we'll see at the end of the chapter, the action is, of course, the most important part. But why is the emotional part of it so important? Ki hamakaimun be'emes hu ha'oyeves Hashem Hashem v'chafetz l'davka be'emes v'efsh l'davka be'emes ki im b'kiyim ramach pikudim shem ramach iver the malka kaviyachol kameshe kasav b'makim acher. That's because you only genuinely fulfill the mitzvah when you love God and desire to truly bond with Him. It's impossible to truly bond with Him by any other means other than fulfilling the 248 positive mitzvahs. By bonding to them, you are bonding, page 85, to Him, since they are, figuratively speaking, the 248 limbs of the king, a metaphor explained elsewhere, and that goes back to the question of how do we connect to God? Right? So as we opened up the class with, you're feeling a great love for someone. How do you express it? There's only one way to express your love for someone. That's to act on it. How do we act on our love for God? God doesn't want gifts, and God doesn't want us to say, I love you with nothing behind it. By doing what God told us to do. God gave us 248 commandments. These are 248 ways of connecting to Him. The parable of the limbs, right? The limbs that we explained how the 248 positive mitzvahs correspond to the 248 limbs. We're not going to count them. But those 248 limbs also correspond to God limbs. God doesn't have limbs. God doesn't have a body. What does it mean God has limbs? If you think about it, a limb is a way that we interact with the world around us. And so God's limbs, quote unquote, are the mitzvahs, are the ways that He can interact with us. The only way that we can connect to God is by acting on those mitzvahs. And therefore, what's the only true motivator? You could do anything once or twice. You could not be feeling it. You could, what's the expression? Close your eyes and think of England. Just like completely just disassociate and do it. But if you want it to have continuity, you want it to be an ongoing, there has to be emotion behind it. You have to be doing it out of love. That's the only way you're going to commit to putting on tefillin every single day, or lighting Shabbos candles every single week, or learning Torah every single week. Whatever mitzvah you want to do, it has to come from a place of emotion if you want it to have continuity. Once or twice, you can do it. Trust me, I put on tefillin with many people who were not feeling any emotion at that time. But to have a continuity, for it to be truly, genuinely long-lasting, there has to be that love before. And so too on the other side. What's stopping me from doing something that I want to do? I want to go and, commit a sin. I want to go do something that God doesn't want me to do. What stopped me from doing that? Well, once or twice, I can control myself. But if I want it to be an ongoing thing, that every single time I'm faced with this challenge, I overcome it, the only way to do that is if it's coming from a place of fear. Now's the time to address, what do we mean by fear? So fear can be very literal, what we call in Torah, fear of punishment. I know that if I commit a sin, God's writing it down and He's going to punish me. Whether it's Rosh Hashanah time or whether it's after this world, I'm going to get punished. And you know what? That's a good place to start. If that's the only thing we can relate to, so be it. That's a good place to start to stop us, that fear of what's going to happen to me if I sin. But that's a very juvenile relationship with God, a very transactional, I don't want to get hurt, so what's a deeper level of fear? Is what we call fear, but shame. If you respect someone, if you love someone, you don't want to go against them. Right? I'm not mad, I'm disappointed, and that bites even deeper, right? That I don't want to disappoint God. I'm ashamed of what what I'm doing, and I don't want to experience that. I'm afraid of that shame, and that's the motivator. That's the yira. That's the fear that's stopping me. But there's something even more. It's not about, I'm not embarrassed. I'm in awe. Fear from the expression of, I know how great God is. And I am in complete awe of Him. I don't want to lose that. I'm afraid of what I'm going to do to my relationship with God. And those are the different levels of fear. All of those are expressions of fear. But those are all the motivators of what's stopping me from doing the 367, I think. Mitzvos. What's stopping me from doing them? The negative commandments. What's stopping me from going against God's will? Well, once or twice, I can stop myself from doing anything. But if I want it to be long-term, it has to be coming from a place of fear. As we continue on page 85, the hayira, he sheirish l'shasa leisase 365. Yes, thank you, Dave. Someone's math is right. Leisase kiyira Fear, on the other hand, is the origin of your fulfillment of the 365 prohibitive mitzvahs. You refrain from doing these things because you dread the very notion of rebelling against God, King of all kings, who transcends and pervades all that exists. Or you have a more intimate sort of fear, a sense of shame before his greatness. You can't imagine doing anything spiteful of his magnificence, all-knowing presence, anything that he considers evil. Now, what would be something that God wouldn't want us to do? What does God consider evil? Kol toyavas Hashem asher sani. What does he consider evil? All the things that are despicable to God, that which he hates. Continuing on page 86. Haim klipos v'sitra achra asher yinikasam meha adam atachtim v'chizasam bayu b'shasam mitzvos leisase. This refers to the negative forces of the klipos and the sitra achra. Those words, we mentioned them in chapter 1, which was a while ago, so I'll retranslate them. Klipos means shell, and sitra achra means the other side. The klippa is in this context, the impenetrable shell that is blocking up this item, something that isn't kosher, something that isn't allowed. It exists, which means there has to be some spark of godliness there powering it, but there's a husk, there's a shell, that means that godliness is inaccessible, this is off limits. Sitra achra literally means the other side, because that's what it is. There's a side of holiness, and there's the other side. Now, if they're against God, and if God doesn't like them, then how do they exist? What's going on? How do they get their power? What is making them be? They nurture themselves from the human being and latch onto him when he, the Adam below in this world, violates the 365 prohibitive mitzvahs. That is something you dread, since you feel God's presence and how despicable these things are for him. Either way, when you keep these prohibitions out of fear, the emotion becomes a vital force within your restraint. When I, God forbid, perform a sin, whatever I did that sin with is now getting its life force from my action. In fact, we'll discuss in the later chapters of Tanya, in a few chapters, that this is how they get their power. They're parasites. These sitra achra, these klippos, these negative forces are parasites that when I, God forbid, fall into the trap, or when someone falls into the trap and performs a sin, they leech energy, they leech life force from that person. Now, if me, someone who's afraid of God, and ashamed before God, and dreads the possibility of being disconnected from God, knows that, I don't want to sin. And that becomes the motivator of why I don't sin. And so to summarize what we've discussed till now in this chapter, the intellect and emotion, generally speaking, the fear and love that I experience for God, that is the motivator behind when I do or don't do mitzvahs. When I do a positive mitzvah, what should be powering that? What is powering that? The love that I fear for God. When I refrain from doing a negative thing, what's powering that? What's powering that restraint? My fear of God. And so that's the way the soul, which the soul itself is just made up of emotions. It's just things that it experiences. It's not things that it can do. How does it do? Through the three faculties of thought, speech, and action. So now that we know that, we have the soul itself and the clothing, the faculties that it inhabits in order to act. Which one do you think is higher, spiritually speaking? The soul itself or the clothing that it inhabits? Anyone want to guess it? We'd want to say the soul. Right? The soul, right? If we think about ourselves, what's higher, what's better, what's more important? Ourselves or our clothing that we wear? Of course, ourselves. But the difference is, as the Alter Rebbe is about to explain, our clothing that we're talking about here are not just random things. These are the mitzvos and the Torah that God gave us. And the main important difference about that is that there's a huge downside to the soul itself, which is as much as the soul at its essence is a piece of God himself, the soul as we experience it down in this world is extremely humanized. It's limited by what we can feel and what we can think, It's limited by our humanity. Yes, the soul at its essence is extremely high. But as we mentioned, as it comes down through all the world to inhabit a body in this physical world, that's a pretty big descent. And the soul in this world is so limited because it's human, right? It's a human soul. Right? What are the 10 faculties of the soul? Understanding God, thinking about God, loving God, fearing God, all of those things are limited by our humanity. How much could you possibly love God? Well, a lot, but I'm still a human. I'm still limited by what I can comprehend. And therefore, the 10 attributes of the soul are limited by the humanity. They're human attributes. The garments, on the other hand, what are the garments? The Torah and mitzvos, which come directly from God, and that's going to be the focus of the rest of the chapter. Us realizing that the actions that we perform and the Torah that we learn is so much higher. What do I care that it's so much higher? It can make the soul become so much higher, because when the soul is acting, when the soul is doing a mitzvah, it's accomplishing so much more than it can ever do on its own. And this is why it's such an important point. The Alter Rebbe is going to really explain this in depth, because very often we get stuck in this trap where you meet someone that says, I don't do the mitzvos in actuality. I love God, I have an emotional connection to God, and that's enough. My relationship with God is I'm a very spiritual person. The problem with that is that our being a very spiritual person is limited by the amount that I can relate to that spirituality. I'm a physical person. I don't really understand spirituality. So when someone says, I'm a spiritual person, I don't need to do the mitzvos, what they're essentially saying is, my relationship to God is going to be as limited as I am. On the other hand, when we realize that spirituality is great, but we have to act on that spirituality. We have to make that spirituality, whether that's a fear or a love, makes us do the mitzvos, because then what is my relationship to God limited by? Godliness, by nothing. God isn't limited, and neither are his mitzvos. The potential for connection that I can build through doing the mitzvos and learning Torah is infinitely greater than what I could possibly do by just being a spiritual person, which is going to be limited by my humanity. As the Alter Rebbe will continue to explain on page 86. V'hine, shleisha levushim elu mahatera u'mitzvayseha, af shenekrein levushim lenefesh ruach neshama, im kol zeh, gavaya u'gedola ma'alasam le'en kates v'seif al mailas nefesh ruach neshama atzmam. Now, these three forms of engagement provided by Torah and its mitzvos are called clothes for the nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Right? Clothes are merely an accessory to the person who wears them. Nevertheless, when it comes to these clothes, their quality is immeasurably higher and greater than that of your nefesh, ruach, and neshama on their own. They are higher and greater because they are clothing of Torah. As the Zohar tells us, Torah and God are completely one. Page 87. Perush. The Araisa hi chachmasi v'ritzoni shel Kadosh Baruch Hu v'Kadosh Baruch Hu b'chveidu v'atzmei kol echad. Why are they one? Because Torah is not just profound wisdom; it is God's wisdom and desire, and God Himself, at His essence, is entirely one. For He is the knower, and He is the mind that knows, and He is the knowledge that is known, as quoted above from the Rambam. Right now, when we learned this earlier at the beginning of chapter 2, we ended off by saying we can't really understand this, but we could know the facts. The fact is, when I am learning Torah, no matter what part of Torah I'm learning, I am learning God's essence. I am experiencing, I am becoming, and I am utilizing God's essence, God's Himself. Now, there's a bridge that has to be crossed here, and we're going to find exactly where that bridge is. The bridge between the infinite and the finite, between God and humanity. That bridge has to exist somewhere, right? Because naturally, not that natural is really a word that we can use in this conversation, but naturally speaking, we have absolutely no way to possibly relate to God. We are finite, and God is infinite. In this world, you could be a pretty simple person, and you can meet the smartest, most talented person ever, but you can relate to them. You have some common ground. You're both people. Right? Even if you can't relate to the thoughts going on in their head, you can relate to the fact that you both enjoy eating food. You can relate to the fact that you both have to go to sleep at night, right? If you're ever looking for, for good small talk, what you have to do is you have to find common areas, something that you both, you can both talk about. You can't do small talk about their latest PhD theory in math because that's just beyond you. You have to find something that you can relate, and that's how you build a connection. With God, there is no overlap. We're finite, God is infinite, and we cannot bridge that gap at all. We have no way to relate to God. So what did God do? God built a bridge, just like only God could. God built a bridge known as Torah and mitzvos, which at their core, what they really are, is God himself. But they bridge by coming into this physical world. And we can sit here and we can learn, now we're learning lofty things, so it's easy to relate to. But if you open up a Talmud, a Gemara, a Mishnah, and you learn about what's the law if one guy's ox gores the other guy's ox. You're learning about oxen, you're learning about the physical world at its coarsest level. And in fact, you could even be learning about something worse. A lot of the Talmud talks about two people come to court, this person says it's mine, that person says it's mine. By definition, one of those people has to be lying. We're talking about the lowest of the lowest possibility. We're not just talking about the physical world, we're talking about people sinning and people lying in the physical world. That is God. Torah and God are one. Why? Because God built that bridge to connect our finite reality with his infinite reality. So yes, when it comes into our finite reality, we experience it as laws that we can relate to, and we experience it as laws about people lying, and laws about oxen, and yes, Tanya and Kabbalah, and everything in between. But that is because God built that bridge. As we continue on page 87, true, God is called the infinite. His greatness is unfathomable, and no thought can grasp anything about him. The same is true of his will and wisdom. As is written, there are no means to understand him. It is also written, if you will seek to fathom God, page 88, will you achieve it? And it's written, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. So clearly there's this divide that we cannot bridge. It is in reference to this paradox that our sages said, it is that very place where you find God's greatness, there you find his humility descending into the lowest places. There's a famous thing that people have about Judaism, is Judaism is so picky, so nitty-gritty. The Torah has laws about how you put on your shoes in the morning. There's an exact order we're supposed to follow. And the question is, that's what God cares about? God, the great, infinite, unfathomable God, cares about what order I put my shoes on in? And the answer is yes. Why? Because God even cares about that. Everything we do, down to putting on our shoes, is an opportunity to connect. And we do it properly. That is by putting on our shoes in the right way. For those that are curious, the way we put it on is we always preference the right side. So we put on our right shoe first, then the left side. Except that when it comes to tying, we know that Torah puts a preference on tying in connection with the left side, right? We tie tefillin on our left side. For any lefties, this is reversed. But we put on first our right shoe, then our left shoe. Then if it has to be tied, we tie the left shoe, then we tie the right shoe, because the preference is to the left when it comes to tying. Why? Because God is so infinite, he even cares about how I put on my shoes. Why? Because that's another opportunity to connect it. So yes, does Judaism get really, really technical into the minutiae that no one else cares about? Yes. But is that because God is limited? No. It's because God is infinite, and therefore every opportunity is everything in every moment is an opportunity to connect to him. As the Alter Rebbe continues on page 89, v'tzimtzum gadol, v'tzimtzim HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'tzornei v'chachmasei v'taryag mitzvos HaTorah. So God compressed his infinite desire and wisdom into a finite number of 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. Ubehilchaseyim, into the rules for each of those mitzvahs, ubetzirufei oisias Torah neviim ukesuvim, into the combinations of letters that make up the Torah, prophets, and scriptures. V'drasheseyim ba'al shabbagades ubemidrashei chazal, into the interpretations of the text as they are delivered to us in the anecdotes and parable told in the midrashim of our sages. This doesn't only apply to the minutiae of the details of the Torah, but also into the very letters that make up the Torah. Those are not accidental; those are there by God. And a lot of people have a lot of fun with the different values of different letters and the exact formation of words. You could go; it's a whole very fun activity. Does it have any meaning? Yes, it does. You have to know how to do it. You have to know how to access it. We're talking about accessing God, which means you have to approach it from a place of humility and a place of wanting to look for the right thing and knowing how to do it. But everything about the Torah, the minutiae of the laws, the very letters that are make up, and the random anecdotes that are brought. The Talmud has a lot of random stories that are brought. If I learn that I connect to God, some rabbi talking about a story, no, there's no halachic implications. It's just a story that a rabbi once said. But the fact is, it's included in the Torah. Why is it included in the Torah? Because it is part of God's transmission into this world. Yes, it's a tiny, tiny detail. It seems unimportant. It seems almost wrong to make that holy. But that's because God's infiniteness, God's greatness can be found in the smallness of what God gave to us and what God, quote unquote, cares about. Continuing on page 90. Bichdei shekol haneshama ruach v'nefesh shebeguf ha'adam tuchal lahasig b'daita ulakayma kol ma she'efshar lakayim mehem b'maisa dibur machshava. He did this so that your entire neshama, ruach, or nefesh, as they are within a human body, could mentally grasp His infinite wisdom and His desire. You can grasp them as they are invested within all these mitzvahs, texts, commentaries, and stories, and you can fulfill whatever is practical in action, speech, and thought. This way your divine soul can invest herself, all her 10 faculties, within these 3 clothes of thought, words, and action that are God's infinite wisdom and desire. So again, the 10, we've been calling them attributes, but the 10 faculties or attributes, the 10 parts of your soul, the different feelings it can have, the different understandings that it can have. How does it express itself? How does that become part of something greater? How does it act on those? Through the 3 clothing of thought, speech, and action. Why? How does that able to accomplish anything? Because the actions that it's doing are not random actions. These are godly actions. These are the bridge that God built into this world. Is it really random? Tomorrow morning, if you put on your shoes the right way because you know that it's a mitzvah, and you do it that way, you're just connected to God? What are we talking about here? Yes. Because that is the bridge that God created into that moment. That moment can become godly, and your soul can be inhabiting the 3 clothing, the thought, speech, and action, in that moment by doing that mitzvah. Therefore, we find an interesting parable about the Torah. The Torah is compared to many things, but one of the most famous things that the Torah is compared to is water. Why? Because anyone who's ever had a bad leak can tell you, water will always strive to go as low as possible. And water has a great ability to fight its way down. And water will always go down and permeate and ruin, if we're talking about a leak in your house, anything that it finds at those lower levels. And that is what the Torah does as well, as the Alter Rebbe continues on page 90. That is why Torah is compared to water. Ma mayim yordim mimakim gavaya lemakim namuch, kacha Torah yordim mimakim kaveda. Just as water always descends from a higher place to a lower place, so the Torah descended from the place of its glory as God's desire and wisdom, as the Torah is perfectly one with God, who cannot be grasped by thought at all. Umisham nasa v'yarda miseser madrega madrega lamadrega b'shtal shlusa elamis. It traveled from that place, descending and secreting itself into each level through which it passed, through tiers upon tiers of multiple realities in a chain of descent through all the spiritual worlds. The Torah leaked from on high. At its essence, where it started from, it is God Himself. The Torah is godliness. The Torah is the way God thinks and the way God operates and what God wants, which at its core is God itself, as we explained, or not explained, as it were, as we said. But what happened to that? Just like water trickling down through layers and layers of stone or whatever, whatever water filters do, it goes down and parts of it are lost in each level. Or another way of saying it, parts of it permeate each level. Which is why we're referencing these 4 levels that we can understand Torah on. We can understand Torah on the literal level, a slightly higher level, the esoteric level, the secret level. Why? Because we can access different levels of that the Torah came down. When we learn Kabbalah at its core, we're learning the way the Torah is at a much higher spiritual level. On the other hand, when you open up a Mishnah and you're learning about people lying in court, you're learning Torah. It's the same essence of God, but that's the way it comes down into this very, very physical and coarse world. As we continue on page 91, until it became invested within physical matters and concerns of this world, which is what virtually all the mitzvahs of the Torah and its rules are about. And it became invested in the arrangement of the physical letters written in ink on parchment, the 24 books of the Torah, Prophet, and Scriptures, all that this great descent and extreme investment is, is so that now anyone's thoughts can grasp God's infinite desire and wisdom. Even speech and action, which are lower on the spiritual ladder than the verbal thought, can now grasp them and become invested within them. Malbishim kol eser b'chines hanefesh v'chol toyagiv v'reah mireish v'adragla harei kula tzrura b'tzrura hachayim es Hashem mamish v'ar Hashem mamish makifa umalbisha mireish ad v'adragla. And here's the main point of why we have mitzvahs. Now that the Torah and its mitzvahs clothe all of your soul's 10 faculty and all her 613 spiritual limbs from head to foot, your entire soul is literally wrapped up in a bundle of life with God, and God's light literally encompasses and clothes her from head to foot. What the soul cannot accomplish and not do on its own, because the soul is human, essentially, the soul is a human soul, it can accomplish and become reconnected with God through doing those mitzvahs and through learning that Torah. Page 92. This is the meaning of the verse, my rock, I cover myself within him, and like a shield, desire will surround you. Right? This rock and this desire is his desire and wisdom as they are invested within his Torah and its mitzvahs. Within them, you are wrapped up within God himself. When we do a mitzvah, what's happening is our godly soul, which is experiencing a very human emotion of love towards God, is now able to become one with God. It was one with God as its soul. I don't want to lose that idea, because yes, the soul itself at its core is God, is one with God. That's what we said at the beginning of chapter 2. But now it's no longer experiencing that state. The soul that we experience in this world is a very human soul. How can that connect to God? How can that reconnect? How can that become one with God? How can that experience godliness? How can it surround itself with that experience? By doing the Torah and mitzvahs. Because the Torah and mitzvahs, as much as it seems to be in this world diluted, and as much as it seems to be in this world a very physical action or thought or understanding, it is still very, very much part and one with God. And when we learn that Torah and we do that mitzvah in this world, we are experiencing God himself. Therefore, there's a fascinating fact that the Talmud tells us, that the Mishnah tells us. This is from the Ethics of Our Fathers. This is continuing on page 92. V'lochein amru yafa sha'achas b'tshuva u'maisim tevim ba'olam hazeh mikol chaye olam haba. This is what the sages said. One moment of returning to God and doing good deeds in this world is better than all the life in the world to come. The world to come is the way the soul is not limit. The way the soul experiences godliness. It sits and it basks in God's greatness. But the soul that we're talking about is still our human soul. And therefore, its ability to relate to godliness is going to be limited by that soul's limitations. No matter how, if you imagine you're experiencing a beautiful view, your ability to appreciate that view is very much going to depend on your sight. right? If someone has very poor vision, they could be standing at the Grand Canyon, and it won't be the same experience. Every soul is limited in certain ways, as we discussed, based on the exact process that it descended through the different worlds. And therefore, when the soul is experiencing godliness in the world to come, it's limited by the soul. But what happens when we do a mitzvah? Are we limited by the soul itself? No. Because no matter how much I can understand and how much I can do when I do that mitzvah, right? The person who doesn't speak a word of Hebrew, doesn't understand anything, when they do a mitzvah, they are connecting to God the exact same way the most righteous and holy person, which knows everything, is connecting God. Obviously, there are details missing, and obviously you need the emotion and the understanding. It all enhances it. But the essence of what you're doing, you're connecting to God. Right? Whether you're learning the most simple verses of the Torah, and you're learning the most simple basic laws of day-to-day life, or you're sitting and basking in Kabbalistic understandings, you're learning Torah, you're connecting to God Himself. And therefore, 1 hour in this world of the ability to connect to God Himself beyond our own limitations is better than the entire world to come, where the soul is going to be limited by its own limitations. Continuing on the bottom of page 92. Ki olam haba hu hena miziv hashchina shehu tainug hasaga. What is the world to come? It is the experience of enjoying the radiance of God's presence, a pleasure of comprehending divine light. Page 93. V'ef shelishum nivra afilu ma'al yonim lahasig ki im ezu ha'arim ma'er Hashem v'lechem nikra b'shem ziv hashchina. But no created being, even the loftiest, can comprehend more than a mere reflection of God's light. That is why it is called only the radiance of God's presence. Right? When we say they're basking in God's presence, they're basking in a reflection, in an array of God's presence. As for God Himself in all His glory, no thought of any being can comprehend Him at all. But when your soul grasps Torah and its mitzvos and invests herself in them, then she does grasp God Himself and invests her being within His. Hence, Torah and God are completely one. Now, to end off the chapter, the Alter Rebbe will address one final point. And that is, as much as we can explain and understand the theory of that when I do a mitzvah, I'm connecting to God's essence, it still doesn't feel that way. I'm still just putting on my shoes, right? It still doesn't feel. How can we understand this idea more clearly that even when, yes, I'm just putting on my shoes, I am still connecting to God's essence? And the Alter Rebbe will explain this with the parable of getting a hug, right? Because when you give someone a hug or you get a hug, is there any thought in your mind, if it's in the winter and they're wearing a heavy coat, or if it's in the summer and they're wearing a short sleeve shirt, is there any difference in your mind about the emotion and connection behind that hug? No. I can understand that, yes, there's clothing in the way, but the hug is what matters here. And whether it's, if it's 0 degrees outside and so we're both wearing heavy parkas and therefore there's, very, very thick layers separating us, or if it's the middle of summer and there's almost nothing separating us, that hug is still the same hug no matter what. As the Alter Rebbe explains on page 94, true, the Torah comes to us dressed in lowly, mundane, physical matters. Don't such garments obscure the divine will and wisdom that they clothe? She'ein hefresh b'mayla his keravsusi v'tzvichusi b'amelach bein mechabke kishu lavush echad bein shu lavush kama lavushim me'achar sheguf hamelach b'seicham. But compare this to embracing a human king. The quality of your closeness and bond with the king is just the same whether you embrace him as he is dressed in a single garment or dressed in many garments. All that matters is that the king himself is inside. So too, when embracing God through the mundane physical matters of Torah and its mitzvos that clothe him. The same is true in a verse. If the king embraces you with his arm, it makes no difference that his arm is clothed within his garments. Page 95, this is what God does through his Torah. As it says, his right arm embraces me. This is speaking of the Torah that was given from his right arm, representing kindness and water. The Torah comes down to us in this clothing of physical matters through God's kindness, just as water runs freely downward. When God's right arm, quote unquote, gives us the hug, what is that? God is hugging us with the opportunity to connect to Him. Yes, sometimes when you get the hug from the king, he's wearing many, many robes, and there seems to be many layers there. But of course, we all understand that the connection, the hug, is just the same. And so therefore, to summarize what chapter 4 talks about, chapter 4 is, up until now, the most important chapter we've spoken about, because this is the most practical thing we've spoken about till now. Because it's explaining to us that yes, we all know we have a soul, as discussed in chapter 2. We understand what that soul experiences, the intellectual and emotional aspects of what that soul is made up with. That was chapter 3. But what does that do for me? What can I accomplish with that? How does a soul do anything? Is through the faculties, through the clothing of thought, speech, and action. What thought, speech, and action are the actions of the godly soul? Doing mitzvos with our thought, speech, and action. And it's so much greater. What the godly soul accomplishes through the thought, speech, and action is so much greater than it can ever accomplish by itself. Because no matter how spiritual someone feels, no matter how smart they are and how much they think they understand God, that's all limited by their intellect, by their emotion, by their ability to feel and to understand. On the other hand, when we do any mitzvah, whether it's putting on our shoes in the right way, putting on tefillin, Shabbos candles, learning Torah, whatever we're doing, we are connecting to God's essence. Because God created that bridge. That even though when the bridge crosses over, and it's on this side, it seems very mundane, it seems very simple, it seems almost too silly for God to care about, we have to realize is the reason why even the quote-unquote silly things are part of Torah and mitzvos, because that is God creating a bridge to that moment. Even the smallest, minute details, God wants to connect to us there, and therefore He bridged Himself into that moment by giving us the opportunity. And yes, we should always strive for more and strive to understand deeper and strive to understand loftier ideas, but that doesn't take away from no matter what we're learning, whether it's the letters of the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet themselves are Torah. If we're learning that or we're learning Zohar in Hebrew, both of those are connecting to God's essence, and that is the soul, the godly soul, expressing itself through the clothing that it has access to. That was chapter 4. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. We, God willing, are looking forward to next week. We continue with chapter 5 as we continue to unpack and understand the operation of the godly soul. And again, just sort of the flow of where we are in the Tanya in general. The Alter Rebbe is going to be using these chapters to explain to us how the godly soul operates. Then we'll move on to understanding how the unholy, the animal soul operates. Because once we understand those two things, we can understand the battle that is raging within us, and we can understand how to win the war when it comes.